Good afternoon in Paris and Berlin, good morning in Washington, D.C., and good evening in Tehran. My name is Ivan Sashashian. I'm a professor of public and international affairs at the University of Baltimore in the United States, where I serve as the Associate Dean of the College of Public Affairs. Of direct relevance to our roundtable discussion on Iran and TV today, my work focuses on the democratic opposition in Iran and U.S. policy towards the Iranian regime. I am delighted to be joined in conversation today by three distinguished former U.S. officials. Directly to my left, Marc served as Chief of Staff to U.S. Vice President Mike Pence, and prior to that as Director of Legislative Affairs at the White House. Marc, we frequently tune in to your analyses on CNN and other prominent news outlets, and we're delighted to have you with us here today. To his left, Ambassador Lincoln Bloomfield Jr. has held senior national security positions in 5 U.S. presidential administrations, including as Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs and U.S. Special Envoy. And to his left, Ambassador Robert Joseph served as Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security, Special Envoy for Non-Proliferation, and on the National Security Council as Special Assistant to the President during the global war on terrorism. Gentlemen, thank you to each of you for being here today. Over the course of the next 45 minutes, I'd like to get your thoughts on several important topics. We'll start by examining the ongoing election in Iran. We'll then turn our attention to policy toward the Iranian regime, what it is currently and what it could or should be. And finally, we'll pivot to Iran's pro-democracy opposition, the NCRI and the MEK. Let's start with the presidential election in Iran. As it happens, today is election day in Iran. And Iranians are looking to replace their former president, Ibrahim Raisi, sometimes referred to as the Butcher of Tehran, who was killed in a helicopter crash earlier this spring. I think a few points of order are helpful to frame our conversation both for our viewers around the world. Number one, it's important to note that women cannot be candidates for election in Iran, since Iranian law stipulates that one of the necessary qualifications to run for national office is that the office holder be a man. Number two, all of the candidates that are approved to run for the highest office in the land must be vetted by the regime's Guardian Council, which is comprised of 6 clergy appointed by the supreme leader and 6 Islamic jurists appointed by the head of the judiciary, who is himself appointed by the supreme leader. As you might expect, with so little democracy to speak of, parliamentary elections held in March and May resulted in extraordinarily low turnout. I believe we saw as little as 20% turnout in the first round of those elections and just 7% in the second round. And many of the scholars that I've spoken to suggest those may be generous assessments. So, Ambassador Bloomfield, I'll turn first to you on this matter of the presidential election in Iran. Given my framing statements, what do you make of an election that resembles what I just outlined?
Well, thanks, Professor Sheehan. It's a pleasure to be with you and with our distinguished guests and to address our audience in Iran. I know many of them are watching because they're not going to the polls. Many people have boycotted the elections. The first election after the revolution elected President Bani Sadr. Only one candidate was disqualified from that because he would not accept the religious authority of the supreme leader that Ayatollah Khomeini invested in himself. So that was Masoud Rajavi. Everyone else was allowed to stand Bani Sadr became president. But as the people were worried about the dictatorship of the mullahs, they took to the streets. And on June 20, 1981, hundreds of thousands of Iranians protested, and 500,000 in Tehran alone. And that's when Khomeini started the reign of terror. They opened fire on the crowd. They impeached the president of the republic. They killed 3 of his closest associates, shut down his publications. And after that time, there were 2 presidents in 1981. One was Ayatollah Khamenei, was the president of Iran during a reign of terror. And from that point on, very few people have been allowed to stand on the ballot. So it's really not a choice. You say that women are not allowed to be candidates. I have to say, maybe they should allow real Iranians to be candidates. There are many brilliant, wonderful, patriotic Iranians who would love to serve their country, but have no chance, because what the Supreme Leader is doing is trying to pick someone who will succeed him eventually. And Raisi died in the helicopter crash. He was going to be the next Supreme Leader. Now what does the Supreme Leader do? So he has 4 people that either are very hardline, like him, or they're easy to control, like Mr. Pezeshkian. It is not a real election. I regret that my own government is treating it like an election. They should not. It's not democracy, and it's an insult to free countries when a dictatorship pretends to put a facade of democracy.
Ambassador Joseph, Ambassador Bloomfield has described this in essence as a sham election. I'm eager to hear your thoughts on the candidates that have been approved to stand. There are 6 of them, as you know, and they include former members of death commissions who are responsible for heinous massacres of political prisoners, IRGC officials who have engaged in terrible human rights abuses, and political hardliners that are unlikely to break ranks with the Supreme Leader. Your thoughts?
Well, first of all, thank you. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here today with my distinguished colleagues. My thought is that we start with the basic. This is a dictatorship. It's not a democracy. So everyone who runs for office is hand-selected by the Supreme Leader through the Guardian Council, and in some cases in other ways. This is a sham that is designed by the regime to reflect a sense of legitimacy. But I think the outcome is just the opposite. Whether it's the people of Iran who have rejected, clearly through very, very low turnout, as Ambassador Bloomfield just pointed out, rejected the notion that this is a free and fair election. And also, you know, the effort of the regime to describe to the world that it is taking into account the views and the feelings and the desires of the Iranian people, which it is clearly not. And the Iranian people are rising up. The pressure has been building and building. After sham election after sham election does not turn that around. And I think we are headed for the ultimate outcome of a free Iran once this regime either collapses from its own internal contradictions or from the pressure that can be placed on it. I agree that the Western countries, the Western nations should not treat this election as free and fair. And in doing so, they do a great deal of harm. They should listen to the Iranian people. They should take their cue from what the Iranian people are doing, boycott this election, call it for what it is, and do what we actually need to do to support the Iranian people, and that is to support the opposition that is opposed not just to this sham election, but to the very foundations of this religious dictatorship.
Marc, I'll turn to you. As I said, we tune into your assessments of domestic politics in the United States. Do you think any of this is being overstated, and do you agree with the assessments of your colleagues?
Well, thank you for having me, and yes, of course, I agree with these distinguished guests here, the ambassadors. But I think first it's important for the people in Iran who may be watching today that they know America is grateful for their courage in standing up against enormous oppression. It is disappointing that more Western countries are not standing with them at this time, but I also think that as the recent death of President Raisi, we hope and pray for the day that we can all be gathered together in a free and democratic Iran for these conversations moving forward. But I do want to just echo the ambassador's comments that in the Western nations, it's important that they stand on the shoulders of those who went before them as standing for democracy and standing for freedom, and speak clearly into this moment and give thanks to those in Iran who are standing up against their oppressors, because it's not just in the interest of Iran, it's frankly in the interest of the United States and Western democracies too.
Ambassador Bloomfield, you've written a great deal about the opposition, their history, but you've also seen many elections in Iran. As you know, the president of Iran is the second most important official in Iran, but the most important and influential official is the supreme leader, and he holds the real power. I wonder if you could speak to how important women and young people are when it comes to this election and what power they hold. And I ask you this because the misogynistic regime in Iran ranks among the worst in the world when it comes to its treatment of women. And the candidates themselves seem not to hold any ideas that will resonate with the next generation. Your thoughts on any of those points?
Well, thank you. The reason I've written a lot is that I've tried to study the nature of the regime. How did it come to power? How has it stayed in power for 45 years? What are the things it has done? And we can talk about a lot of the news articles all over Europe, all over North America, all over the Middle East that are essentially aggressive actions by this regime. I will quibble with you if don't know how it translates into Farsi, but there is no second most important official in Iran. There really is only one influencer, and that's the supreme leader. And I say that because as a national security professional, the only things that matter to me are what happens to the nation's resources, how is the money spent, and what happens to the nation's manpower and technology, and what have they done? They've put it in instruments underneath the supreme leader to build a nuclear capability, to develop ballistic missiles, to develop drones, which are now appearing not only in Ukraine and killing innocent Ukrainians, but they're in Ethiopia, they're in Sudan, and they'll probably end up in a lot of countries fueling conflict, which is a shame. I think when you mention women and children in Iran, they are the heart and soul and the beauty of Iran. And I've watched the executions that have taken place. A 16-year-old girl who was dancing to music and was not wearing a hijab, executed. 20-year-old, these beautiful young people. And it seems to me that this shows that the election process has nothing to do with the real Iran, with the people of Iran, with the soul of Iran, with the future of Iran. One thing that has always impressed me about the people of Iran is that they study science and technology, something as an academic we struggle to teach our kids math and science and chemistry and physics. Iran does this very well. They're very capable. They're engineers, including the women. And this can be one of the most successful countries on earth, and we want it to be, but it will never be successful as long as this corrupt group of people using religion for political power are stealing the resources and committing aggression inside the country against their own people and against the rest of the world. We are now uniting to say, please, make it stop. And we, as Mr. Short says, we stand with the people of Iran and we salute their courage.
Ambassador Joseph, I know that you have spoken out for years in support of Iran's democratic opposition and exile. I trust you'd like to speak to some of those same points from your perspective.
Well, I certainly agree with everything that Ambassador Bloomfield has just said. I also would like to point out that there is a never-ending fallacy, and that fallacy with regard to elections in Iran, or so-called elections, truly sham elections, and that is that if we encourage this regime through concessions over time, that it will become more moderate, and we will see moderate candidates emerge from the process. Nothing could be further from the truth. As was pointed out, these individuals who are candidates are always entirely selected by the supreme leader, who has total control. There is no path for moderation, and it's certainly not in the election process or any other means. The regime cannot reform, the regime cannot become more moderate, because if they do, they know that the people of Iran will understand what the game is, will reject any movement toward this notion of moderation and at least false moderation. And I think it's incumbent upon the Western countries to understand that and to not encourage that. I think through our policies we have actually encouraged that false notion. We need to reject it. We need to understand that this is a religious dictatorship. We need to understand that the freedoms that the Iranian people seek will not be through sham elections, but it will be through the activities, the dedication, the sacrifices of the Iranian people, including the ultimate sacrifices that have been made and that will continue to be made by the opposition that supports true democracy in Iran.
Mr. Short, Ambassador Joseph says that the regime will not reform from within. I think this brings us from the election to U.S. policy, and not just U.S. policy, but the policy of Western governments. The United States, Europe, the Western powers have had 45 years to come to grips with this notion that the regime will not reform if left to its own devices. Why have these powers been so reluctant to adopt a coherent and effective policy on Iran? And what do you think has been missing from that policy?
Well, I think what's been missing, frankly, is courage. I think that Ambassador Joseph is right. There's been far too much appeasement. And I think this current administration in the United States has wanted to follow the Obama administration policy of appeasement toward Iran. And I think that I had the distinction and honor to serve in the Trump administration, and I recall being in the White House when Secretary Pompeo brought to the president the opportunity to eliminate General Soleimani, who had hurt and killed many Americans on the battlefield, and certainly was a threat to the entire Western world. And I think those actions, by acting with strength, I think Iran was put in a position that you showed actually how little they could respond in that moment. And I think the maximum pressure campaign certainly had significant economic impacts that I think impacted international policy as well. And I think it's sad to see this current administration revert back to the Obama administration's policies, and whether or not that is allowing now up to 60% enrichment in uranium, or whether or not it's allowing financial benefits for Iran that we have seen sow all sorts of discord across the Middle East in their funding of the Houthis and Hezbollah. And so it is bewildering why we continue to revert back into this course, as opposed to seeing when there have been administrations that have stood strongly and isolated Iran, how much better we've been. And I will say one other thing, that when President Trump made the decision to pull out of JCPOA, there were all sorts of calls from Western allies begging him to change his mind. And I think that as well is a lack of courage from many of our traditional Western allies who should be standing for freedom and standing for democracy. And I think the best way to actually bring about change in Iran would be to stand in strength and not in appeasement.
So lack of courage and a policy of appeasement. You brought up the maximum pressure campaign, and you had a role in supporting those initiatives. I wonder if you might unpack for us some of the instruments that were effective as part of that campaign.
Well, I think that financially, being able to isolate Iran when they frankly have benefited from trade with the Western world, I think had significant impact on in that isolation. I think there's also many more moderate Middle Eastern countries who I think were looking for more normalization, and I think once Iran was isolated, it enabled things such as the Abraham Accords to happen. Without that, I don't think the Abraham Accords would have ever happened. That was not simply an effort of diplomacy. That was an effort that was driven by the fact that there was a maximum pressure campaign against Iran. And I think that certainly that what's needed is being able to build an alliance with other Western nations. And I think that if you actually step forward and take those initial steps, such as withdrawing from JCPOA and seeing that it does not bring about an end and collapse in other relationships, then other Western nations will follow with you.
Ambassador Bloomfield, there seems to be this longstanding interest in treating the Iranian regime as kind of a permanent fixture of the Middle East landscape. And I think that some of that may be wrapped up in this, as I think Ambassador Joseph was suggesting, the search for moderates. I wonder if you might speak to that.
I personally think that what's happening in Washington, not fast enough, but it will happen, is to look deeper and look for more answers. In Washington, in my career, with my colleagues, we focused on Russian superpower, we focused on the rising China. We have to do that. There are North Korea, there are other issues that concern us. So I don't think we've looked closely enough at Iran, at what their vulnerability is. The vulnerability they have is that they have no legitimacy. That's why they had 5 or 6 debates to try to sell these hand-picked candidates that the people don't really want. The people know this is just the supreme leader having a functionary underneath him. There's a lack of legitimacy. They have committed huge crimes against their own people, starting in 1980 when they opened fire on their own people, the reign of terror that followed, and that's a term that 2 academics have used in the past. The 1988 massacre of up to 30,000 political prisoners, most of them MEK, NCRI supporters or sympathizers. None of them had committed capital crimes. Many of them were at home. They'd finished their sentences. They were all brought before judges. Some of the judges were Raisi and Pur Mohammadi, okay? And Mr. Nouri in Sweden, who was just convicted, life sentence, but traded for a hostage. And what you look at, if you look deeper, is a regime which is committing aggression out of fear all across the world. Not just drones in Ukraine, but cyber attacks and threatened bombings in Albania, attempted murder in Spain, which was then tied to a murder-for-hire mob group, which is close to Iran in the Netherlands, an attempt in Denmark in 2018, the Nouri trial, where they took a Swedish hostage, Flodorus, an EU official, and traded him back to free up a war criminal. And then, of course, the bombing that was intended in Paris at this event in 2018. This was while the JCPOA was in full effect, before President Trump withdrew. They were going to conduct a mass casualty bombing in the heart of Europe. In fact, there were 2 more in Albania, one against the MEK outside of Tirana, one at an Israeli-Albanian football game. 3 bombings were planned while the JCPOA was in effect. So what I'm saying is, if you look at these crimes all across Europe, and many of them in America, where we have officials now with 24-hour protection against Iranian assassins in America, and now a White House memo warning of cyber attacks against our drinking water, murder for hire in Maryland, the stabbing of Salman Rushdie. It goes on and on. Then you look at the Middle East, and my view is that the Hamas attack on Israel was provoked by the supreme leader who wanted to stop Saudi Arabia from normalizing with Israel. So you look at Mr. Soleimani, who was a very effective person, but his project was to arm Hezbollah, to keep Assad in power, to arm the 8 militias in the Shia militias in Iraq, the Houthis, to encircle the Arab Gulf, all of whom now accept Israel, pretty much. So what I think they're afraid of is that the revolution is ending. It's over. The 3 holy mosques, including Al-Aqsa Mosque, Karbala to Quds, it's finished. And I think what the Iranians fear most is that the men of the regime are going to abandon them because they see there's nothing left. Meanwhile, the women have already abandoned this regime. So it's crumbling. This is why they're lashing out with terrorism, cyber attacks, assassinations, bombings, all of these things. And so I would like Washington to connect the dots, to combine with our allies, and to do some very practical things. We should indict the people who have committed war crimes. We should stop the flow of weapons to Yemen and to Gaza. We can do these things. We should take several steps. We should make sure the people of Iran have satellite communication so they can talk to each other and hear what's happening in the rest of the world. There are many practical measures. We're not doing enough right now. There's work to be done, but we're here as Americans to stand with the people of Iran and to encourage a unified, sensible policy. No one wants to attack Iran. That's not the point. The point is to empower the people of Iran to take control of their own destiny.
Ambassador Joseph, I could see that some of those practical measures, as Ambassador Bloomfield was just outlining, resonated with you. Your thoughts?
Well, I think that clearly we need to take practical steps. I think one of the things we need to start with is to express our moral support for those on the front line and those around the globe in terms of Iranians who seek a free and democratic Iran. The Iranian nation is fighting for the same objectives that we fought for in our own revolution now 248 years ago. And in our Declaration of Independence, we talk about unalienable rights, the right to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. And these are the same goals that people have fought for against dictatorships for over 200 years now. And I think you see this clearly playing out in Iran. The number one threat to this regime are the people of Iran. The people of Iran want to replace this regime, want to become a more normal country, want a country in which their fundamental human and civil rights are observed, where they can flourish. It is a great nation. The Persian nation is a great nation, but it has been hijacked by a group of mullahs for over 40 years now. And I think expressing moral support is important. The practical measures that Ambassador Bloomfield mentioned are important. Whatever we can do to put pressure on this regime, whether it's through sanctions, whether it's through other means, we need to exacerbate the fissures between the people and the government. And I think we can do that, but we must first rid ourselves of this notion that appeasement will bring moderation. We must rid ourselves of the notion that we must contain the nuclear program, because that's been the first priority of American policy for far too long. And the irony is that by making concessions, that by providing resources, we have actually fueled that program. We have made available the resources for that program to move from small-scale enrichment to what is today a virtual nuclear weapon state, in which high-ranking Iranian officials are stating that they have made all of the components necessary for a bomb. All they need to do is assemble it. And other regime officials are saying, well, we might change our doctrine on nuclear weapons and actually pursue a nuclear capability. That will be a much more dangerous policy. But what that demonstrates is this failure to prioritize. We have to put the people of Iran first. And how do we do that? We do that by signaling them in many ways, by pressuring the regime, but also by supporting the democratic opposition, because that's the engine. That's the engine that will make the change. And I think the 10-point plan of Mrs. Rajavi demonstrates the vision for a free, democratic, and non-nuclear Iran.
We have to put the Iranian people first. We have to support the democratic aspirations of the Iranian people. and we have to focus on them more than we focus on the regime itself. You know, this morning I read an article that outlined how in an unprecedented show of unity, a group of prominent international leaders recently issued an open letter condemning the Iranian regime's ongoing human rights violations and calling for democratic reforms in Iran. The letter highlighted the regime's brutal suppression of protests, its rampant executions and acts of state terrorism, and it urged the international community to take decisive action along the lines of what has been suggested here. Do we need more measures like this, more public displays of support? Are those types of measures helpful? And if so, how?
Well, I think that's the least we can do. I think that, you know, as the ambassadors articulated, change has to come from within Iran. But when we talk about the appeasement and the ineffectiveness of those policies, I think that what they've also articulated here today is that the natural tendency for the supreme leader when the pressure is taken off is for him to move back into alliance with Russia and China and those who provide the biggest threats to the West today. And so even though it is certainly in the interest of the people of Iran to fight for free and democratic elections, it's in the interest of the West as well. And we should not shirk from that. We should stand clear and speak clearly into this moment and encourage that change happen from within. Because again, it is certainly our allied interest for the benefit of the people of Iran, but it's also in our own nation's interest because their natural tendency will be to align with Russia and China against our interests.
Well, grassroots change and social movements require leaders, and we know that the democratic opposition in exile, but not just the democratic opposition in exile, the resistance units that exist in Iran serve as a voice of the Iranian people and seek to bring about the type of change that's being outlined here today. I wonder if in our remaining time we could turn our attention to this so-called parliament in exile, the opposition movements that operate under the banner of the National Council of Resistance of Iran. I'd like to turn to each of you and ask you for your impressions of the NCRI and the MEK and whether or not they constitute a viable alternative to the clerical regime. Ambassador Bloomfield, I'll begin with you because I know you've reflected quite a bit on those themes.
Let me start by describing what I admire about the movement before I get to the idea of an alternative. Mm-hmm. Decades ago, they looked at the regime in Tehran and realized that the mistreatment of women was a real weakness of this violent dictatorship. Mm-hmm. So they brought something that the Muslim world really hasn't seen before, which is gender equality. Over time, that has evolved into something even more pointed, which is that the NCRI is led not only by Mrs. Rajavi, but by women at every single level of the organization. One thing I can say, and I doubt my colleagues will disagree, is they are incredibly well organized. They can put together a world-class event very efficiently. So maybe Iran would be a much more prosperous country if they allowed the women to have equal power, equal political power, which is part of the 10-point plan of Mrs. Rajavi. You know, I think that the resistance has been, it's interesting when you talk about how sanctions can push Iran into the arms of Russia, for example. The MEK has been called Marxist for years and years. And Masoud Rajavi laughed about it because the Shah of Iran, when the students were calling for change in the 1970s, some of them were radical, not the MEK, but the others, the secular radicals, were extremists. He wanted the people to hate all of them, so he branded them all Marxist. And then the Ayatollahs did the same thing. Most Iranians may not know this. Ayatollah Khomeini brought the KGB into Iran in 1982 for help because the people were not accepting this dictatorship. So KGB teams flew into Tehran, it's in the newspaper, I'll show you, and advised them on probably some very strict measures of control. So now here we go. The politics of change that Khomeini talked about were to protect Iran against superpower influence from the imperialist West and the communist East. And here they are actually in the arms of Moscow and the Kremlin. So I think the Iranian people probably don't accept that. What I would say about the NCRI, something Washington should understand, is because they have been threatened by this regime for decades, because their lives have been at risk, and many of them have died, they keep very close watch of the regime figures. They have dossiers and intelligence on all of the regime figures that I'm not sure the Western ministries have. They have very good intelligence. So people like us who speak to them, who meet with them, who correspond with them and learn from them, we begin to see a much more granular picture of who are these people, where did they come from, what are they doing in my country and your country. And this is a picture of Iran that changes our assessment of what to do about it. How do we stop this danger? And I think that my hope is that Western governments, including the United States, will pay closer attention to Mrs. Rajavi, the 10-point plan, and the NCRI, not just as someone who wants to take over the country. And this is my last point. You've seen the Shah's son. You've seen other opposition figures. None of them are offering democracy to the people of Iran. They all, the Shah wants to be the leader, the Shah's son. That's not what Iran needs. Iran needs self-government. They need sovereignty at the ballot box. And this is what Mrs. Rajavi and the NCRI have offered. They have said it again and again, and going back to 1980, 1981, they've said, we're not worthy of leading the country unless we win at the ballot box. Legitimacy, the first point of the 10-point plan, legitimacy comes from the ballot box. So what the NCRI is offering is to give the country back to the people of Iran. That's what they're offering. And I think that it's a very noble cause because they've sacrificed so much, and it's not for their own personal benefit, it's for the benefit of the future of Iran. And for that, I salute them.
We all have attended the opposition's events in Washington, D.C. And around the world, and I fully agree with your assessment that this is amongst the most organized and best constituted opposition that I've witnessed anywhere in the world. But I've also come as an academic to trust their granular assessments, as you were suggesting. I have yet to see any of their predictions not come true, and I have yet to see anybody provide more accurate assessments of regime leaders. Ambassador Joseph, I know you've spent a great deal of time both with the rank and file and also the leadership in the opposition. Your impressions of them as an alternative to the ruling theocracy in Iran?
Well, my first introduction to the NCRI goes back to 2002. And the NCRI office in Washington gave a briefing on Iran's nuclear program. I was working just down the block from there at a place called the White House, working on issues associated with nuclear proliferation, and Iran was very, very high on our priority list. I concluded very soon that this monstrous regime, this regime that is not held accountable by its own people, this regime will never give up its aspirations for a nuclear weapons capability. And that has since been demonstrated over the course of the following 22 years until today, when we now see Iran being a virtual nuclear weapons state. I concluded that the only way to contain the problem, to deal with the problem of nuclear weapons held in the hands of this monstrous regime would be through internal change, would be through regime change from within, driven by the people. And again, the people are the number one enemy of this regime. And working with the NCRI over the course of the last good number of years, I've come to the conclusion that this is a dedicated, this is a capable, this is a determined group, organization that will bring change, in a tactical sense through the frontline units that are in Iran today, operating to undermine the capabilities of this regime, actually fighting in the streets of Iran for freedom, fighting for the principles that we all hold dear. This is a organization that has demonstrated its vision and its commitment to democracy, to a secular Iran, to a non-nuclear Iran. The 10-point plan, I think, does say it all. And it does provide sort of that link to what we all want and what the people of Iran want, and that is freedom and democracy and recognition of their basic human rights. There are other pretenders, such as the son of the Shah, but there's a phrase that we use in our country. I don't think that passes the laugh test, quite frankly. I mean, how can the Iranian people get behind the son of the Shah, given the history, given the knowledge of where that would take their nation once again? It's important, I think, to recognize that the NCRI has, as I said, the determination and the dedication. They have paid the ultimate sacrifice, including the mass murder of thousands of their members in the 80s. The NCRI is the public enemy number one in the eyes of the regime for a reason. It's because it is the alternative. It is the alternative, and it is the alternative that can bring the people of Iran together and pursue the objectives that we all hold dear.
Mr. Short, Ambassador Bloomfield says that the NCRI and the MEK have the dedication and the determination. I know you had an opportunity last year to attend a massive gathering of the Iranian opposition in Paris. And I know too that your former boss, Vice President Mike Pence, has had an opportunity to speak at high-profile events in support of the opposition. I wonder if you'd offer your reflections on these movements.
I've also had the honor to meet with Madam President Rajavi at Camp Ashraf, and it's hard not to be inspired by her leadership, and not to be also finding so much commonality in the 10-point plan in wanting to protect or fight for a non-nuclear, secular, and free Iran. And I think that to our previous conversation about the Western world standing in alliance with those fighting for a free Iran, the least we could be doing is guaranteeing the security of that camp in Albania and providing the necessary funding to make sure that it's a secure home and hopefully a place that they can continue to reach into the people of Iran about their vision for a free nation.
The 10-point plan has been invoked, so I think it's important that we unpack just for a moment the NCRI's platform. We know that the NCRI supports elections founded on the concept of universal suffrage. We know that they have had a long-standing commitment to fostering a diverse political system with respect for individual freedoms, freedom of expression, free assembly, academic freedom. We know that they have long been committed to the eradication of the death penalty. We know that the NCRI is committed to separation of religious institutions from the state, while at the same time forbidding discrimination. We know that the NCRI supports complete gender equality for women in Iran, that they have promised to modernize the justice system in Iran, including abolishing Sharia law and introducing reforms that provide new legal protections. We know that they have a commitment to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and that they will seek to implement measures that protect investment and employment, private property, and will work to boost the market economy. We know as well that their foreign policy is grounded in the concept of peaceful coexistence with both regional powers and global nations, that they reject the pursuit and development of nuclear weapons, and that they reject the possession and development of weapons of mass destruction. This is a plan that Western powers can get firmly behind. But Ambassador Bloomfield, you and I know in particular that there has long been a demonization campaign underway, not just in Washington, but around the world. Why is the regime so obsessed with the MEK and the NCRI? I've seen at least one study that suggests that they pay more attention to this opposition movement than all other opposition groups combined. I wonder if you could speak to some of that.
Well, I don't know how much time we have, but I think you've just given the answer. The 10-point plan was first unveiled in 2006, but in my research, I've seen that what Mrs. Rajavi is saying and has said for all these 18 years are the same things that were being said by Masoud Rajavi in 1980 and 81. The very similar doctrine. And it's all I can say. I think I would make one comment. We are worried about peace in the world. If every government in the world lived by those 10 points, including respect for property, women's rights in divorce and employment, all of those points. If every government abided by the 10-point plan, there would be peace in the world.
Ambassador Joseph, it seems to me that this platform really presents an existential crisis, an existential threat to the Iranian regime and all that it stands for.
It certainly does, and I, like everyone else on this panel, support peace in this world. I think the 10-point plan is very visionary. It provides a guidepost for action. But let me also just say something. When I think about Iran today, I also think about the Soviet Union in the 1980s. And I was in government at that point, working Soviet issues. And there was a sense that, yes, it was corrupt, yes, it was incompetent, but things will not change. We will always have the Soviet Union to deal with. And then we didn't. And it surprised a whole lot of people inside the Soviet Union, but I think even more so outside the Soviet Union. There is hope. I mean, the Soviet Union and Iran, much different. They're both unique in so many aspects. But the notion that a dictatorship will collapse from within is, I think, very important. And here I think we need to take a page out of Ronald Reagan's book. Ronald Reagan provided moral support to the people inside of the Soviet Union. Ronald Reagan insisted that the promotion of democracy, the promotion of human rights be part of the agenda with the Soviet Union. And not everyone liked that. The State Department, arms control people didn't like that because that would mess things up. That would make things more complicated, and they would say we really needed to focus on the priority. Well, it turned out, because of Ronald Reagan's insistence, that by pushing moral support, but also pressuring. I mean, remember, there were many things that we used to pressure the Soviet Union at the time. Many different things in the economic area, in the military area. We had a strategy, and I think that's solely missing from Western democracies today with regard to Iran. We need to bring back a coherent, comprehensive strategy, and at the core of that strategy is are the principles that we have all stood for so long in terms of human rights, in terms of democracy. And I think that's got to be up front in this comprehensive strategy for dealing with this regime. Yes, the change has to come from within. Absolutely, it has to come from within. But we can accelerate that change through better policies, through sound policies that will, as I said, exacerbate the fissures between the people and the dictatorship.
We know that tomorrow the NCRI's global supporters will gather in Berlin, and we've seen prior gatherings where upwards of 100,000 individuals have gathered in support of the opposition in exile, and we've seen expressions of support not just from US officials and EU parliamentarians, but leaders from around the world. I wonder what you expect from this gathering that we'll have an opportunity to tune into tomorrow.
Well, I certainly hope that this gathering is a source of great encouragement for the people of Iran who are looking for hope. And I, just reflecting on the ambassador's last words, I think it's also missing in American politics right now. I think we've talked about the appeasement that this current administration is pursuing and how much the Democrat Party misses Joe Lieberman and his voice that he offered. And at the same time, listening to the ambassador, how much we miss Ronald Reagan, because he was such a great ambassador for freedom across the globe. And many in our party, in the Republican Party today, are looking to retreat and advance isolationism. And so we miss leaders that have that clarion call like Ronald Reagan, and pray that someone of that nature will rise up and lead the Western worlds again. And hopefully the people who are gathered in Berlin will know that America stands with them in their fight for freedom.
Ambassador Bloomfield, your reflections on the event that we'll tune into tomorrow?
I think what's noteworthy to me, Professor, is how much momentum is building year after year. There's a list which I can't memorize, but over 125 former heads of government now support Mrs. Rajavi's 10-point plan. There are something like 43 majorities of parliaments around the world. The numbers may be slightly off, but it's going up every year. Each year we find that dignitaries, not only from America, but from around the world, come here and stand with the NCRI. We have our former vice president coming, and we have many other senior leaders, military and civilian, men and women. It's also interesting to see how many notable women stand with the NCRI around the world. It's a great inspiration, and what a shame that in 2024 there are regimes like the one in Tehran that completely exclude the power and the ability and the gifts that women bring to political leadership and to social leadership and to moral leadership. I think Iran is not only running on only one gender, but they're running on some of the worst members of the male gender. And I think my final hope is that the young men of Iran need to find their honor. The women have already decided they detest the Ayatollah's regime. They have been abused by this regime, but the young men are still holding it up. And the day that the young men of the Revolutionary Guards, the Ministry of Intelligence, the Ministry of Justice, and the people with the key to the jail door, the minute they decide in the Quds Force, we're never going to make it to Jerusalem, it's a dream that has gone away. We are putting our lives at risk. We're destroying our neighboring countries. We are causing harm and breaking laws all over Europe and North America. The whole world is turning against us. Have your honor, find your honor, walk away from these senior leaders. They all have tickets on the airplanes in case they have to leave. You don't have a ticket. So it's time for the people of Iran to put their own guns down, walk away from this regime, and let the change come peacefully.
Ambassador Joseph, during the period of time that I have studied the resistance and attended their events, there was one US official who was always present, serving as a bridge in many ways between Republicans and Democrats. Mr. Short mentioned him just a moment ago. in some ways it feels to me like there is one empty chair at our roundtable today. Senator Joseph Lieberman is dearly missed. I know that he was a colleague of yours and that you partnered with him across the aisle. I wonder if you might just reflect on his support for the opposition and what we need more of in Washington and around the world.
Well, Senator Lieberman was not only a colleague. Senator Lieberman was and remains a hero of mine. He had the courage. He had the courage to stand up for what he believed to be right. He had the knowledge of American domestic society, but also foreign affairs. He was clearly one of the earliest supporters of the NCRI. And I think the sacrifices that have been made by, I mean, we talk about Albania. You go to Albania, you talk to the women and the men in Albania. Each one has a personal story. They've lost their father or their mother or their brother or their sister. And that resonated, I think, with the senator. Mm-hmm. And he could compare that to his own personal history. Mm-hmm. And I think that with a man of such stature supporting the NCRI in many different ways, it provides, I think, a sense of hope. And I think he was a man of hope and a man of vision. And he came to the conclusion that I think most of us or all of us share, and that is the change will come. This regime will end, and the people of Iran will be free. And I think that the NCRI and Mrs. Rajavi can provide, as I say, the pathway to that ultimate objective.
I couldn't agree more. And it seems to me that his focus on the malevolent actions of the Iranian regime were consistent with many in the opposition who believe that the Iranian regime is itself kind of the principal focus and the head of the snake, so to speak, in the Middle East, and should remain at the principal focus of attention. You know, I opened our roundtable today by greeting individuals in Paris and Berlin who are preparing for tomorrow's event, but also speaking to individuals in Washington who I know are listening to each of you. But there are also individuals who will hear today's roundtable in Tehran and across the country of Iran. I wonder if I could ask each of you to speak directly to them. We've spoken a lot today about supporting the democratic aspirations of the Iranian people. But what would you like to say to them today as they look towards the future?
Well, as we opened, I think it's important that they know that America stands with them in their fight for freedom. And it's important that America not retreat from that position of continuing to advocate for freedom and democracy across the globe, because it is not just in their interest, but it's also in ours. And it's we, having been to Albania and heard some of the same stories, it's hard not to feel enormous sympathy for those who have suffered so dramatically. But we also hope and pray that the day comes soon that the change comes to Iran, and we hope to be there to celebrate it with them.
What I want our friends in Iran to understand is how much support you really have outside of Iran. In my country, the United States, there are organizations in over 40 states of Iranian Americans who support the NCRI, and they are very active. The people that you see speaking at this table, and many other Americans who will be at the rally tomorrow in Paris and in Berlin, do not just come to one meeting a year. They stay in constant contact on their own time, and even the NCRI doesn't know about it, but there's a constant dialogue, factoring in new information, following what's happening with the executions in Iran, following what's happening with the protests in Iran, following what's happening with the arrests and the hostage takings and the swapping of terrorists in in Sweden and in Belgium. We follow these things all the time. And there's a very large community of people who are in continuous dialogue with the team at the NCRI and in Albania. They know what's going on. So you have an enormous wellspring of support. And I think it will surprise you when the time comes to stand up. We now understand how vulnerable this regime is. The supreme leader is getting old. He just lost the person who was supposed to replace him. They're trying to put forward these candidates and sell them to the people. No one is showing up at the polls. The economy is in terrible shape and getting worse. And meanwhile, they spend all of these resources, the ones that are not the billions of dollars in the religious foundation, they're spending it on the Revolutionary Guards, the Quds Force, and the MOIS, the Ministry of Intelligence, covert operations. This is a disgrace, and it's unworthy of the people of Iran. And when you finally stand up and say, this is it, no more, you will find there's a very large community of people standing with you.
Ambassador Joseph, your parting thoughts for the Iranian people.
Well, on the airplane, on the flight from Washington to Paris last night, I read an interview. It was an interview with a young woman in Iran, a young woman who is one of the freedom fighters. She's on the front line fighting for a democratic and free Iran. And she says in the interview that she was never political. She was just a normal young woman. But the pressure has been building her whole life, and building, and she's had enough. And I think this interview can be a reflection of the Iranian nation itself. The people of Iran have suffered for 45 years corruption, incompetence, brutality, repression, crimes against humanity. Enough. They've had enough. And I think that this is, as my colleagues have said, a vulnerable and desperate regime. This is a regime that very well may be at the end of its days. Freedom will be achieved in Iran. I think that as you look at the history of despotic regimes, of dictatorships, we don't know when it's going to happen, but we know it will happen. There will be a spark, and this regime will come down because of the people fighting for their freedoms and for their basic fundamental human rights to live as free people.
I often remark to my students that there's nothing more important than an idea whose time has come. Gentlemen, thank you for what I think has been a very rich discussion at our roundtable today. My thanks as well to Iran NTV for hosting today's valuable discussion. And to those of you tuning in across Europe, in the United States, and around the world, thank you for joining us. And we trust you'll continue to join in tomorrow and in the days ahead to news coverage, not just about the election, but about the gathering in Berlin in support of the democratic aspirations of the Iranian people.